She was 18 years old, and the maps in her father's office had been lying to her for as long as she could read them. Susan Ward rode out from the ranches along Pine Creek to settle a cartographer's argument no one else cared about anymore. To prove once and for all that the fort marked on every old chart of the High Valley had never been built. She expected a bare meadow, maybe a fallen chimney, maybe nothing at all. What she found, weathered gray and standing taller than any man on the place, was timber walls no living soul had claimed to see. Stay close, and let us know where you're watching from tonight, because the story of what she rode into up that creek is one worth settling in for. Susan Ward had been born in a plank house half a mile above the second bend of Pine Creek, in a valley that ran narrow between two ridges of Ponderosa and Lodgepole, and opened some 10 miles up into a wide grassy park that the ranchers called the High Valley. Her father, Amos Ward, was 51 years old that spring, a cattleman with 300 head and a hard face and a habit of speaking as though every sentence were the last word on its subject. Her mother had died in the winter Susan was 9, of a fever that took 2 other women in the settlement the same month, and after that, the house had gone quiet in a way it never recovered from. Amos remarried within the year, a widow named Harriet Doyle from down near the wagon road, 43 and practical, and not unkind, but not soft either. And Harriet brought 2 sons of her own, boys of 11 and 14 at the time, who grew into the ranch as though they had always belonged to it, and who by the time Susan was 17 were spoken of by Amos as his heirs, without any correction from anyone in the room. Susan learned to ride before she could properly read, and she read early. She learned to shoe a horse from a man named Jonas Beale, who ran the smithy at the mouth of the creek, and who was 68 years old when he first put a rasp in her hand and told her the hoof was a living thing and would tell you what it wanted if you were quiet enough to listen. Jonas had been a farrier in the army before he ever came west, and he had lost a wife and a daughter to cholera in a river town whose name he would not say, and he had recognized in Susan, she was 12 when he first noticed it, a stillness and a patience that most grown men never came to. He taught her to shoe, and then to set a wagon tire, and then to read a map, because Jonas had also been, in another part of his long life, a surveyor's chainman, and he owned a leather-bound roll of frontier charts that he kept in a tin trunk beside his forge, and that he unrolled for her on winter afternoons when the work was slow. He showed her the pencil marks and the compass roses and the small square symbols with the flag beside them that meant fort, and he showed her the one in the high valley of Pine Creek, and he said, calm as ever, that he had never in 40 years met a man who had laid eyes on it. The beloved object came to her the summer she turned 14. Jonas was sick that August, a slow cough that would not leave him, and one afternoon he called her into the smithy and gave her a brass pocket compass in a battered leather case, its glass scratched, but its needle still true, and he told her it had belonged to his daughter, who had been 10 years old when she died, and that he had carried it for 41 years, and that he wanted Susan to carry it now. He died in October. Susan wore the compass on a lanyard beneath her shirt and never took it off, not to sleep and not to bathe, and the leather case grew dark and soft against her skin. By the spring she turned 18, the ranch had settled into a shape that had no clear room in it for her. Harriet's older son, Ben Doyle, was 25 and married and running the north pasture. The younger Micah was 22 and running the south. Amos had begun to talk about the ranch as a thing to be divided in two, and Susan had understood, without being told directly, that she was expected to marry a man from one of the neighboring places and take her portion in the form of a dowry rather than land. She did not argue. She had never argued with her father about anything, and she was not going to begin over a matter that had already, in his mind, been decided. What she did instead, that April, was ask him for the use of a horse and 3 days' provisions and permission to ride up into the high valley and settle the question of the fort on the maps, because Jonas's old charts still sat in the tin trunk in the smithy, which she had inherited along with the compass, and because she had come to feel that if she was going to be handed off to a life not of her choosing, she would at least first ride out and answer the one question that had been sitting in her chest since she was 12 years old. Amos looked at her across the supper table and said only that she should take the roan mare and be back by Sunday, and Harriet passed her the bread without comment, and the two Doyle boys glanced at each other and said nothing, and that was the last conversation of any weight that Susan Ward had at her father's table before she rode out. She left before first light on a Wednesday morning in the middle of April, and the thing she remembered afterward about that leaving was not any single word or gesture, but the ordinariness of it, the way it looked exactly like every other errand she had ever ridden out on, so that a person watching from the yard would have had no way of knowing that a household was quietly closing itself around the space where a daughter had been. Harriet had set out a cloth bundle on the kitchen table the night before, tied with plain string, and when Susan came down in the dark, it was still sitting there in the same place, and inside were 4 biscuits and a piece of salt pork wrapped in brown paper and a small twist of coffee and a tin of matches, which was the provisioning of a person going 3 days into the country and no more. And Susan had not asked for more, and Harriet had not offered. On top of the bundle, Harriet had laid a folded square of paper, and Susan opened it in the lamp-yellow light of the kitchen and read it standing there in her coat. It was written in Harriet's careful, slanting hand, and it said only, in 6 lines, that Amos and Ben and Micah had spoken the night before about the division of the ranch, that a share had been set aside for Susan in the form of $200 in coin and paper to be given at her marriage, that the house and the pasture would go in equal parts to Ben and Micah, and that Amos wished this understood clearly so there would be no confusion when she returned. It was signed simply Harriet at the bottom, without any word of feeling either way, and Susan read it twice through and then folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her coat next to the compass. And she did not sit down, and she did not go back up the stairs. She understood what had been done. It was not cruel in the way a blow is cruel. It was cruel in the way a ledger is cruel, in the way a fence line is cruel, in the way the closing of a door in a distant room is cruel when you are the one who has been left on the other side of it. She had been named, and then she had been quantified, and the naming and the quantifying had both been done in ink at a table she had not been sitting at. She did not cry. She rolled up her spare shirt and her wool stockings and Jonas's leather roll of charts and put them in her saddlebag along with the food, and she took down her father's second-best rifle from its pegs above the mantel, because he had said, "Take the roan," and he had not said, "Do not take the rifle." And she considered for a moment that a person who left in this manner might not, in truth, be coming back by Sunday or by any other named day. And then she put the thought away because it was not yet a thought she needed to answer. She went out through the kitchen door and closed it behind her, so that the latch fell with the soft, small sound it had always made, and she crossed the yard in the blue dark to the barn, where the roan mare was already awake and standing quiet in her stall, and she saddled her by feel because she did not want to strike a lantern. She led the mare out through the gate and mounted in the road, and she looked once at the house, at the single square of window where the kitchen lamp still burned behind Harriet's back, and then she turned the mare up the wagon track toward the creek and did not look again. The track followed Pine Creek up through the lower pastures for the first 2 miles, and Susan rode at a walk because the mare had not yet warmed, and because she herself was still gathering the shape of the day into her chest. and did not wish to hurry it. The dark thinned by degrees. The ridge on her right went from black to charcoal to the color of wet iron, and the ponderosas along it separated one from another as the light came up behind them, and a magpie called somewhere above her and was answered from farther up the creek. The air was cold enough that her breath and the mare's breath made two clouds that mingled and then were left behind. She passed the smithy at the mouth of the creek without stopping. It was shut up and dark, and the roof was beginning to sag along the ridgepole, and she thought that when she came back down, whenever that was, she would climb up and put a straight edge to it, because Jonas would not have wanted the building to fall in on his forge. Then she rode past it, and the wagon track narrowed to a trail, and the trail climbed. By full sunrise, she was 3 miles above the ranch, and the country had begun to change. The grass grew thinner and paler. The lodgepoles closed in on either side, straight and cold and close set, and the light came down through them in long, clean bars that moved across the mare's shoulder as she walked. Susan took the compass out from beneath her shirt and let it hang on its lanyard over her coat. And she took Jonas's charts out of her saddlebag at the first flat rock she came to and spread them across her knee and studied them. The high valley was drawn as an oval about 4 miles long, opening to the north, with the creek running down through the middle of it, and the small square with the flag beside it was placed on the west side of the creek, about halfway up the valley, in a place where the contour lines showed a low bench above the water. She rolled the chart and put it back and rode on. The trail crossed the creek twice on gravel bars, where the water ran cold and clear over the mare's fetlocks, and once she dismounted and led the mare across a slope of loose scree, where the trail had washed out in the winter. By mid-afternoon, her thighs were burning and her lower back had begun to ache in the flat place above her belt, and she stopped in a small clearing to eat one of the biscuits and drink from the creek and let the mare crop what dry grass there was. She did not build a fire. She sat with her back against a lodgepole and closed her eyes for the space of perhaps 100 heartbeats, and she thought of the folded paper in her coat pocket and of the $200 that had been written down on it. And she thought that $200 was not a small sum and was not a large sum, and that it was, most of all, a sum that had been arrived at without her. And then she opened her eyes and stood and tightened the mare's cinch and rode on. The trail climbed for another 2 hours through a long, shaded draw, and then it lifted her out over a low saddle, and the country fell away in front of her, and Susan Ward, at 18 years old, sat her horse on the rim of the high valley and looked down into it for the first time in her life. The high valley was longer than the chart had made it look. It lay below her in the late afternoon light like the palm of an open hand, the creek a bright vein down its middle, the grass already greening in the sheltered places where the snow had gone off first, and the timber standing dark on both ridges above. Susan sat the mare a long while and let her eyes travel it. She saw no smoke. She saw no fence. She saw no cut stump, nor wagon track, nor any sign that a man had ever put his weight down in that country. And she thought, sitting there, that the mapmaker had made his mistake in a warm room somewhere and had never come to see, and that she would ride down and confirm it and turn back in the morning with her answer. She rode down off the saddle and into the park by a long switchback of game trail, and the mare, smelling water and grass, moved willingly. By the time she reached the creek bottom, the sun was low on the western ridge, and the shadow of the timber was already lying across half the valley. Susan followed the creek north on its east bank, walking the mare now, watching the west side for the low bench the chart had shown. She passed a stand of aspen just leafing out, and a beaver slide grown over with willow, and a place where an elk had lain in the grass the night before, and left the shape of its body pressed into the wet ground. Half a mile up, she saw the bench. It was not much of a bench. It rose perhaps 12 feet above the creek on the west side, a shelf of grass and scattered pine, backed by a steeper slope of timber that climbed to the ridge. She would have ridden past it without looking twice, except that Jonas had marked it. And because Jonas had marked it, she turned the mare into the creek and crossed to the west bank and rode up onto the shelf. And there, set back into the timber where the young pines had grown up thick around it in 40 years or more, stood the walls. She stopped the mare and did not dismount at once. The walls were of squared timber, notched at the corners in the old style, laid in a rectangle perhaps 40 feet by 60 feet. The logs weathered to the pale silver gray of long-standing wood, cracked along their lengths with the slow checking of many winters, but still sound in the corners where the notches held. The walls stood about 9 feet high. There was no roof. Along the top course, where a roof had once been carried, she could see the mortised sockets where roof beams had sat, and 2 or 3 of the beams themselves lay along the inside of the walls, fallen inward, gone dark and soft with rot. A gate opening stood in the south wall, wide enough for a wagon, its hinges rusted iron pins driven into the jambs, the gate itself long since gone. Set into the north wall was a smaller doorway, framed with heavier timber, that had once led into some interior room built against the inner face of the wall. That room's own walls still stood, half height, of the same squared timber. Susan dismounted and tied the mare to a young pine and walked in through the gate opening on foot. The ground inside the walls was grass and pine duff, and the fallen roof beams and a scatter of stones that had once been a hearth. She turned in a slow circle and looked up at the top of the walls against the darkening sky. She said aloud, to no one, that Jonas had been right, and the mapmaker had been right, and every man in Pine Creek who had said the fort was never built had been wrong for 40 years. Her voice sounded small inside the walls, and the walls held it a moment and gave it back. She made her camp that night against the inside of the south wall, near the gate, where the wall would break the wind and where she could see the mare picketed on the grass outside. She built a small fire of dry pine and boiled coffee in a tin cup, and ate a biscuit and a piece of salt pork, and she slept in her blanket with the rifle laid along her right side and the compass on its lanyard against her breastbone. She woke twice in the night, once to a coyote calling on the east ridge and once for no reason she could name, and both times she lay still and looked up at the top of the wall against the stars and felt the size of the thing above her and slept again. In the morning she went over the fort. She began at the gate and walked the inside of the wall clockwise, running her hand along the logs, testing the notches at the corners, counting the roof beam sockets. 42 sockets. She stepped over the fallen beams and made her way to the small room built against the inside of the north wall. Its own doorway had no door, and its floor was a bed of pine needles and mouse leavings and the dry gray scat of a pack rat that had lived there some winters and moved on. Along its back wall stood the stone chimney and the hearth. The stones fitted dry without mortar, blackened at the throat where fires had burned. Above the hearth, set into the timber, was a mantel shelf of one squared piece of pine, worn smooth on its upper face. Susan knelt at the hearth and cleared the pine needles away with her hands. The hearthstones were laid flat, 6 of them across the front, the middle stone larger than the others and set slightly higher, as if it had once been meant to sit level and had shifted. She rocked it with her fingertips, and it moved. She took her belt knife and worked the blade down along the near edge of the stone and levered slowly, and the stone lifted a 1/4 inch, and then, with the second pry, came up out of its bed. Under the stone was a hollow the size of a man's two hands cupped together, floored with a flat piece of tin cut from what had once been the top of a lard bucket. On the tin sat two things. One was a small canvas sack, closed at the neck with a leather thong, heavy in a way that meant metal inside it. The other was an oilcloth packet tied with twine, flat and square and about the size of a folded letter. Susan sat back on her heels beside the hearth. She did not open either thing at once. She looked at them where they lay in the hollow, and understood that whoever had built the fort and roofed it and cooked at that hearth had also, at some point, lifted the middle stone and put those two things under it and set the stone back, and that no one had lifted the stone since. She took out the canvas sack first. She loosened the thong and poured its contents into her cupped palm and counted. There were 41 gold pieces, $20 coins, worn but bright at the rims where they had rubbed against each other, and one smaller coin, a $5 piece, put in perhaps to round the sum. $825. She poured the coins carefully back into the sack and closed it and set it beside her knee. Then she took up the oilcloth packet and untied the twine and unfolded the oilcloth on the hearthstone. Inside it was a folded sheet of heavy paper, browned along the creases but not brittle, and a smaller thing wrapped in a scrap of red flannel. She unfolded the paper first. The writing was in pencil, in a plain square hand, and it filled most of one side of the sheet. It said, "To whoever finds this. My name is Elizabeth Merrow. I was born in 1814 in the state of Vermont, and I came into this country in the summer of 1847 with my husband, William Merrow, who was a carpenter by trade and a soldier before that. We built these walls in the 2 years following, meaning them for a stopping place for the freight road that was surveyed to come up this valley and did not come. William died of a fall from the north wall in the September of 1849 and is buried under the tallest pine on the bench above the gate. I stayed here alone 11 years after him and kept the roof on and ran a small trade with the men who came through hunting and trapping. And I saved what I could against a day I meant to go back east and did not. I am 61 years old as I write this, and I am going down out of the valley tomorrow to the settlements because my hands are no longer steady enough for the winters here. I am leaving $825 in coin and this letter for whoever comes after me and finds this hearth. It is not a fortune, but it is honest money saved out of 11 years of work, and I would rather it went to a person who came into this valley and saw these walls and knew what they were, than to lie under the stone until the stone itself is gone. I hope you are a young person. I hope you have use for a place. The walls are sound. The chimney draws. The creek does not fail. God keep you. Elizabeth Merrow, September the 4th, 1860. Susan read it once through, and then she read it again, and then she folded it back along its creases and set it on her knee, and unwrapped the scrap of red flannel. Inside the flannel was a brass pocket compass in a leather case. The case worn dark and soft, the glass scratched, the needle when she held it flat, still swinging free and settling true to north. It was the mate to the one hanging at her breastbone, or near enough the mate that she could not, at first, tell them apart when she laid them side by side on the hearthstone. She sat a long time at the hearth with the two compasses touching, and the letter on her knee, and the sack of coin at her side, and she did not weep, but she put her hand flat on the mantel above her and held it there as if she were greeting a person who had just come into the room. Susan Ward stayed at the fort 9 more days that first trip. She did not ride down to Pine Creek to announce anything, and she did not touch the $825 except to count it a second time and put it back in the canvas sack and set the sack under the loose hearthstone with a folded piece of oilcloth over it. She took the letter with her in the inside pocket of her coat, next to Harriet's 6-line note, and she took Elizabeth Merrow's compass in its red flannel and put it in the same pocket on the other side of the letter, so that the two compasses hung close together across her chest, with only the wool of the coat between them. In those 9 days she worked. She walked the walls a second time and a third, counting sockets and testing corner notches with the flat of her hand. She cleared the pine duff out of the interior room and swept the hearth with a whisk she made by binding a handful of dry grass to a stick with a strip of red flannel torn from Elizabeth Merrow's scrap. She cleaned the chimney throat with a long green sapling and a rag tied at the end, and drew a thin fall of soot down onto the stones. She built a small fire on the hearth in the afternoon of the 4th day, and watched the smoke climb straight up the flue and out above the roofless walls. And she said aloud that Elizabeth had been right. The chimney drew. She cut and dragged 4 young lodgepole poles from the timber above the bench, using her father's second-best axe, and laid them across the mortised sockets in the small room as the beginning of a roof over the hearth. She did not have shakes or tar or canvas enough to close it in, and she knew that. And she left the 4 poles as a promise to herself, and rode back down to Pine Creek on the 10th day with the letter and Elizabeth's compass in her coat, and the $825 still under the hearthstone. At the ranch, she told Amos plainly at the kitchen table that the fort was standing, that she had found it where Jonas's charts said it stood, and that she meant to go back up and put a roof on the small room and hold the ground before winter. She did not mention the coin. She said she would take the $200 set aside in Harriet's note as her share, and would spend it on lumber, nails, shakes, tar paper, and a small stove, and she asked for the loan of the roan mare for the season. Amos looked at her for a long minute over his coffee, and said the mare was hers to keep, and that he would send Ben up in the wagon with what she bought at the mill. Harriet nodded once and did not speak. Ben and Micah glanced at each other across the table as they had done the morning she left, and this time Ben said he would go. She rode to the mill at the settlement on the wagon road the next day, with the $200 in coin and paper in a leather pouch inside her coat, and she spoke to the miller, a man named Ephraim Salt, 62, widower, who had known Jonas Beale and who had shod horses at Jonas's forge as a young man. Ephraim Salt sold her 1,500 board feet of rough pine, 2 bundles of shakes, a keg of cut nails, a roll of tar paper, and a small sheet iron stove with 6 lengths of pipe. And he took $184 for the whole of it, and threw in a bag of stove bolts because, he said, Jonas would have wanted her to have them. Ben Doyle drove the wagon up the valley trail with the load in the last week of April, and Susan rode ahead on the roan. Ben was 25 and quiet, and had never been up into the high valley in his life, and when he came over the saddle on the rim and looked down and saw the gray walls and the pines on the bench, he pulled the team up and sat a long time on the box without speaking. Then he clucked the horses and drove down. He stayed 4 days, helped Susan set the ridgepole, and lay the roof beams across the small room, cut the shakes to length with a froe he had brought from the ranch without being asked, and drove back down on the 5th morning, saying only that he would come again in June with the 2nd load. A week after Ben went down, a woman rode up the trail alone on a stout gray gelding, leading a pack mule. She was Nellie Fry, 47, midwife and herb woman from the Lower Creek, widow of a teamster killed in a runaway 6 years back. Nellie had known Elizabeth Merrow's name from an old account book of her husband's, and had ridden up because word had come down through Ephraim Salt at the mill that a young woman was putting a roof on the fort. Nellie brought a sack of dried beans, 2 jars of honey, a paper of tea, a bundle of pennyroyal and yarrow tied with string, and a pieced quilt her mother had made in 1849. She stayed 2 nights, showed Susan the plants along the creek that would keep through the winter dried, and rode back down without ceremony. In the first week of May, an old man named Thaddeus Kemp, 71, retired freighter, walked up the trail leading a burro loaded with a small anvil, a bellows, a set of tongs, a hammer, and a bundle of horseshoe stock. All of it out of Jonas Beal's smithy, which Thaddeus had bought at auction the year before for $11, and had been holding, he said, until he saw who came for it. He would not take money. He set the anvil on a section of squared pine inside the south wall near the gate, and left the burro tied and walked down. Ben came back in June with the second load, and this time he brought Micah, 22, who spoke less than Ben and worked harder, and the 2 of them together with Susan raised the second interior room against the west wall in 9 days, chinked the gaps with clay from the creek bank mixed with dry grass, and set the sheet iron stove on 4 flat stones inside the smaller room with its pipe run up through a tin collar Ben had cut and hammered himself. Micah, on the last evening, sitting on the mantel stone with a tin cup of coffee, said that Amos had asked after her twice. Susan said she was glad to hear it and did not press him further. By the middle of July, a boy of 16 named Wesley March, orphaned that spring when his father was thrown from a horse near the settlement, walked up the trail with a bedroll and a rifle and asked whether he might work for his keep. Susan looked at his hands, which were narrow and unmarked, and at his eyes, which were steady, and she said yes. Wesley March stayed. He learned to split shakes from the fro Ben had left, to shoe the mare from the anvil Thaddeus Kemp had set inside the gate, and to read the charts Jonas had left in the tin trunk that Susan brought up in a canvas sack on the 3rd wagon load in August. By the first snow in October, the fort had a tight roof on both interior rooms, a stove that drew, a stack of split lodgepole 8 feet long against the north wall, 200 pounds of flour and 100 pounds of beans in a cedar chest Ephraim Salt had sent up as a gift, and a hand-lettered sign on a plank above the south gate that read, in Susan's careful print, Marrow Station, Pine Creek High Valley, in memory of the woman who had built the walls and left the letter under the hearthstone for whoever came after. People in the settlements began to call it that. Freighters coming up from the wagon road to hunt in the fall spoke of stopping at Marrow Station for coffee and a night out of the weather. Trappers coming down in the spring with pelts stopped there to shoe their horses at the anvil inside the south gate, and Susan took payment in coin when a man had it and in trade when he did not, and she wrote each transaction into a green cloth-bound ledger she kept on the mantel above the hearth, in the same square pencil hand in which Elizabeth Marrow had written her letter, because Susan had, without meaning to, learned to write like her. Nellie Fry came up twice a season with her herbs and her news, and stayed a night each time, and slept under her mother's pieced quilt on the pine bunk Wesley March had built against the west wall of the small room. Thaddeus Kemp came up in the spring of the 2nd year with a 2nd burro and a 2nd load of iron stock, and stayed a week teaching Wesley to draw a horseshoe out of a bar. Ephraim Salt sent up a paper of garden seed with the June wagon, and a note that said only, Elizabeth kept a garden on the south side. Try there. Susan cleared a patch of ground 20 feet by 30 on the south side of the fort in the 2nd spring, turned it with a spade Ben had brought up, planted potatoes and turnips and cabbage and a row of hardy peas, and by late August she was carrying baskets of vegetables into the small room and laying them out on the mantel to cure in the dry mountain air. Amos Ward rode up in the 3rd summer, alone, on a bay gelding, with a bundle behind his saddle. He was 53. He stayed 2 nights. He said very little. On the morning he left, He set the bundle on the mantel and rode down without opening it. Inside the bundle was Jonas Beale's leather-bound roll of frontier charts, which Susan had left in the tin trunk in the smithy on the day she rode out, and a folded page in Amos's own hard hand, which said that the $200 had been her mother's marriage portion, and that he was glad it had gone to a roof and a stove, and not to a stranger. Susan put the note in the inside pocket of her coat, with Harriet's 6-line note and Elizabeth Marrow's letter, and she unrolled Jonas's charts on the mantel beside the 2 compasses, and she stood a long time with her hand flat on the pine. That evening, after the charts were spread and the 2 compasses set side by side on the mantel, Susan sat on the hearthstone with the fire low and the door of the small room open to the summer dusk, and she listened to the creek running below the bench, and to the mare shifting in the pole corral Wesley had built against the east wall. She was 21 years old. She had ridden out of her father's house 3 years and 3 months earlier with 4 biscuits and a piece of salt pork and a folded note that valued her at $200. And she had spent that $200 on rough pine and cut nails and a small sheet-iron stove, and she had never spent money better. The $825 still lay under the middle hearthstone in Elizabeth Marrow's canvas sack, untouched, because Susan had not needed it yet, and because it did not feel like hers to spend on any ordinary thing. She thought of Jonas Beale, 68 years old and coughing by his forge, unrolling his charts for a 12-year-old girl and setting his finger on a small square with a flag beside it. And she thought of Elizabeth Marrow, 61 years old and alone, kneeling at this same hearth on the 4th of September in 1860 and tucking a canvas sack under a stone for a stranger she would never meet. 2 people who had loved someone they never saw grow into what she had become. Susan took Elizabeth's compass from her coat pocket and unwrapped it from the red flannel and laid it on the mantel next to Jonas's compass, and the 2 needles settled toward the same north within the width of a hair. The plank above the south gate read, Marrow Station, Pine Creek High Valley, and below it Wesley March was carrying a bucket of creek water toward the stove, and beyond him the pines were dark against a sky still green at the ridge. Susan Ward was 18 and cast off with $200 written on a folded note. She had ridden out to settle a mapmaker's mistake, and she had spent that $200 on a roof over walls a dead woman had built for whoever came after. It was the best $200 she ever spent, and the walls, which no living man had claimed to see, were standing yet, and she was standing inside them, and she was home. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who has been counted out of a place they helped build. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and what walls in your own life you found still standing after everyone said they were never built at all.